With us now, NBC's Matt Bradley in Tel Aviv. Amna Nawaz, co-anchor of the PBS NewsHour and an MSNBC contributor, and Ambassador Alon Pincus, former Israeli Consul General in New York. Matt, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said yesterday's attacks are not the end of the story. So what could potentially be coming next?
Yeah, I mean, the whole region is still kind of on a war footing, waiting to see what happens. And the big kind of other shoe to drop here is Iran. You remember Hezbollah, who were the ones who launched those attacks yesterday. And of course, it was Israel who launched the attacks first in what they called a preemptive strike. Hezbollah had vowed to attack Israel, as you mentioned in your introduction, to retaliate for the assassination of a top Hezbollah official just outside of Beirut a month ago. Well, hours after that assassination, there was another one in Tehran, the capital of Iran, of a top Hamas official named Ismail Haniyeh. Iran has also vowed to retaliate, but they haven't yet. So that's kind of what the entire region is waiting for. But there's still these negotiations that are ongoing in Cairo. And I spoke with a top Israeli official yesterday and was told that Israelis believe that Iran is waiting to see how these negotiations go before they decide whether or not and how they're going to be retaliating. So that's still something that's kind of out in the open. We don't know exactly what is going to happen there. And that's why we heard from Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin yesterday saying that those two aircraft carrier strike groups are going to be remaining in the Middle East until further notice as a deterrent against any Iranian strike. So everybody is still on a war footing here, and it's unclear exactly what's going to happen. But I can tell you right now, this burst of violence that we saw over Israel's northern border and Lebanon's southern border, even though it's the worst violence we've seen over that border for nearly 2 decades, it was cathartic. It really did kind of release a lot of tension in the region. Both sides declared victory. Both sides said that there were no civilians killed, and both sides said that there was minimal damage. This means that after a month of sky-high tensions and anxiety, it looks like, at least on this border, things have returned to something like calm.
Yeah, I mean, Ambassador, I guess the word of the day here seems to be containment. But what really is containment, and what is a definition of calm, to use Matt's term?
Well, hi, Jose. First of all, I apologize for the music. You don't want to know where I am. But okay. As for containment, look, the idea that containment replaced escalation as the word of the week or the word of the day or the word of the month, if we get that far, is a good thing. Now, both sides needed a winning narrative. And even if that narrative is incompatible, I mean, the two narratives are incompatible, it's okay as long as it's contained. Israel claims that it's foiled via a preemptive strike, a massive Hezbollah attack. Hezbollah is saying this was all a decoy and a deception. We did what we needed to do. We hit where we needed to hit. We have not used precise missiles, and we're happy. So if both sides are happy, that's good. All that being said and established, Jose, this round looks like everyone seems to be declaring victory, but this by no way or means the end of this conflict. And that is because whatever is happening in Lebanon is linked, even though the Prime Minister of Israel refuses or declines or defies that logic, it is linked to what's going on in Gaza. Only a ceasefire in Gaza would de-escalate Lebanon. And as long as there's no ceasefire in Gaza, and I don't see one in the foreseeable future, what you're seeing in Lebanon is going to continue. Perhaps on a lower intensity, but will continue.
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna, just speaking of low intensity versus, high intensity, the fact is that it's such a volatile time in such a volatile region. What would an all-out war between Israel and Hezbollah mean for the region? And, Lebanon has seen what that means.
Jose, that's exactly the right question here, which underscores this idea that neither side, neither Hezbollah nor Israel, want an all-out war. They know what that has looked like before. Back in 2006, they had that larger war for several months. southern Lebanon, much of it where Hezbollah is based, was left in absolute ruins. Tens of thousands of people were displaced. And in the years since, it's worth pointing out, too, that Hezbollah has only ramped up its military capabilities since then. So Israel certainly does not want a war on two fronts, to be fighting both in Gaza and a more robust Hezbollah force from southern Lebanon. So that's in both countries' interests there. I want to underscore, too, what the ambassador was saying here about a ceasefire, because it's worth pointing out that Hezbollah and Israel have been trading fire on an almost daily basis, basically since Israel's assault in Gaza began after the Hamas attack on October 7th in Israel. This is now certainly the heaviest fighting and heaviest strikes we've seen over the last couple of days. But Hezbollah has basically said they would stop those strikes if there was a ceasefire. Matt very well laid out how those ceasefire talks sort of limp along with no real progress, but it comes down to this at the end of the day. A ceasefire seems to be the only way to end the Palestinians dying. The death toll has now crossed 40,000, to surge humanitarian aid, to bring the hostages home, and it seems potentially to secure the situation on that southern border of Lebanon, the northern border of Israel, and avoid a wider war.
And I mean, the fact that Iran has, and there were some activity over the weekend from Iran, but that massive attack that we saw, recently with hundreds of missiles and drones into Israel, there's phase one, Iran announced, is done, but there's an expected phase two. What role and responsibility does Iran have in all this?
Well, Iran is at the center of all of these activities. That, Hamas and Hezbollah are linked as allies because of their support through Iran, and we know Iran backs a number of other proxy groups in the region as well. I mean, that is where these larger worries about a broader regional conflict stem from. That at the center of that spoke of concerns is, of course, Iran. And they have pledged retaliatory strikes for the killing of the Hamas commander Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran last month. They blame Israel for it. Israel has not taken responsibility for that. So that continues to loom. And that is, as you point out, Jose, that's what's underscoring the broader concerns about a wider regional war.
And Matt, I mean, I was just mentioning a ceasefire deal. Where do things stand with a ceasefire deal? Where are negotiations and who's behind them?
Yeah, well, as ever, Jose, they stand shrouded in pessimism. Ever since the last successful deal we had in November, it only lasted a week, but it released about half of those Israeli hostages. It brought a week's calm to the Gaza Strip, relatively speaking, and freed quite a few Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails. But ever since then, we've been seeing a familiar pattern. The U.S. administration blasting out saying, this is close to a deal. We're getting the parties on both sides, even as they're pouring in more and more diplomatic resources. I mean, we just saw that that Antony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, made his 9th visit to the Middle East in 10 months just a couple of weeks ago. And that doesn't even count the other diplomats who have been traveling back and forth, including Bill Burns, the head of the CIA. This is a huge endeavor by the Biden administration. And, they haven't been successful so far. And that's because both parties, Hamas and the Israelis, are still pretty far apart. And even though we've been hearing constantly from the administration that Israel has already acceded to a deal, they haven't. Because the Israelis, and this has been said by diplomats among the intermediaries and including American diplomats to American media, saying that the Israelis are putting in additional stipulations, particularly from Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister. One of the most recent ones he added was that he wants to see a more permanent Israeli presence along the Philadelphia corridor. Now, that's just another term for the border between the Gaza Strip and Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. That irked not just Hamas, but also the Egyptians who share that border. So that was a tough new demand, and one that, according to an Israeli official that I spoke with yesterday, I was told that there had been some kind of understanding between the Egyptians and the Israelis on that, but it looks like that's another sticking point, another barrier. It really just doesn't look like this deal is going to be gelling anytime soon. Jose?
And I mean, Ambassador, I know you're a critic of Netanyahu, but does it seem to you as though Netanyahu's government is actually interested in a ceasefire? We have to remember that there are still hostages being held.
No, they're not interested. They haven't been interested since November. In fact, they have undermined any possibility when a deal seems to be within reach. That was true before the initial deal in November, and certainly after November. And again, when President Biden presented his proposal, which he correctly introduced as an Israeli proposal on the 31st of May. That's 2.5 months ago. No, Mr. Netanyahu is not interested in any deal that would de facto end the war. He's interested in the prolonging of the war. He's interested in a controlled escalation, even though it's doubtful whether anyone, certainly not him, can control escalation. And so I'm extraordinarily pessimistic, unfortunately and tragically, about the prospects of a deal, a ceasefire and a hostage deal.